Looking for more information about lobster industry issues from the perspective of U.S. and Canadian researchers? Tune in to this episode of Maine Policy Matters to learn more. This is the Maine Policy Matters podcast from the Margaret Chase Smith Policy Center at the University of Maine. I'm Eric Miller, Research Associate at the Center. On each episode of Maine Policy Matters, we discuss public policy issues relevant to the state of Maine. Today we will be covering James and Ann Atchison's article entitled, "What Does the Future Hold for Maine's Lobster Industry?", which covers problems the industry faces that threaten its future, including shell disease, climate change, increased regulations to protect right whales, and economic uncertainty. They also focus on several approaches that could help protect the lobster industry, including enacting lower trap limits, expanding markets for live and processed lobster, and increasing in-state processing capacity. This article was published in Volume 29, Number 2 of Maine Policy Review, a peer-reviewed academic journal published by the Policy Center. James, who went by Jim, was an eminent, internationally recognized scholar whose work transcended disciplinary boundaries including anthropology, economics, biology, public policy, and natural resource management. He received 3 National Science Foundation grants and authored over 90 articles in professional journals, along with 5 books, including, most notably, The Lobster Gangs of Maine, published in 1988, and Capturing the Commons, Devising Institutions to Manage the Maine Lobster Industry, published in 2004. This episode is dedicated to Jim's life and the work he accomplished. After briefly summarizing the article, we will speak with Rick Wahle, Patrice McCarron, and Geoff Irvine about what has been happening in the lobster industry in the 2 years since the article was published. Rick Wahle is a professor in the University of Maine School of Marine Sciences and is the director of the Lobster Institute at the University of Maine. Patrice McCarron is the executive director at Maine Lobstermen's Association and the president of the Maine Lobstermen's Community Alliance. Geoff Irvine is the executive director of the Lobster Council Canada. Lobster is the most valuable fishery in the country, and most lobsters landed in the United States are caught in Maine. Lobsters have been an important food source for New Englanders since early colonial times and for indigenous peoples before. In more recent years, overall lobster landings were worth $485.4 million in 2019. The Maine lobster industry is one of the world's most successful fisheries, with a high of 132.5 million pounds being caught in 2016. From 2018 to 2019, catches declined but still remained over 100 million pounds each year, playing a significant role in Maine's economy. Despite the relative success of the industry, it may face increasing problems in the future. When their article was published in 2020, Jim and Ann Atchison named shell disease, climate change, North Atlantic right whales, and markets, tariffs, and other economic matters as the 4 major problems facing the lobster industry today. Episodic shell disease produces unsightly pits, growths, and lesions so that the affected lobsters cannot be sold as high-quality dinner lobsters. Shell disease has had a small effect on Maine's lobsters to date, but has had disastrous effects on catches in Rhode Island waters. Between 2008 and 2013, an estimated 30% of Rhode Island's fishermen were put out of business and others faced severely reduced incomes. Climatic change due to an increase in atmospheric warming has led to increased storms, retreating ice, and rising sea levels that have caused lobsters in Maine waters to shift to colder Canadian waters. Lobster industry advocates do say that lobster can be caught all along the Maine coast despite this observation in the general movement north. Changes in herring movements, leading to large schools of herring seeking cooler and deeper waters, is leading to a scarcity of a major bait source in Maine waters. All of the ecological complexities regarding climatic change in the Gulf of Maine are something that researchers are continuing to understand. The lobster industry's problems with the right whales began in 1996 when Max Strahan, who had petitioned the federal government to list the spotted owl as an endangered species in the Pacific Northwest, sued the Commonwealth of Massachusetts under the Endangered Species Act to prevent whales from being killed by lobster gear. In a different suit brought to court in 2020 by conservation organizations, the federal judge hearing the case ruled in their favor and found that the federal government was not doing enough to protect right whales from being entangled by lobster gear. Fishermen feel that they are being unfairly targeted because most whales are killed by ship strikes, and the proposed rules do nothing to curb ship strikes. Environmentalists argue the law is still not being enforced and that whales are still being killed by lobster gear. The Maine lobster industry believes that its whale protection plan is not being given enough credit for reducing risk to the whales. The latest federal omnibus spending bill included a 6-year pause on new whale regulations while funding research as well as innovative fishing gear development, which has been celebrated by the lobster industry and criticized by some environmental groups. Lobster fishermen have faced economic problems for a number of years, which they describe as a cost-price squeeze. Between 2003 and 2013, the cost of bait increased 500% in response to reductions in the quota fishermen are allowed to catch. Other costs to fishermen have also skyrocketed. Fuel prices increased from $1.50 per gallon in 2002 to $5 per gallon in 2010. Prices declined in 2020, but increased again in May of 2022 to peak at $6.43 per gallon for diesel before lowering to the mid to low $5 per gallon mark later in 2022, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. A new 36-foot lobster boat, which might have cost $125,000 in 1998, can cost upwards of $400,000 in 2020. The decline in revenue combined with markedly higher costs has put many fishermen in precarious financial straits. An economic study points out that there have recently been large year-to-year swings in lobster prices, quantities, and revenue. In 2020, the market for lobsters was reduced again by the COVID-19 pandemic. Not only had the Asian market already been shrinking due to the Chinese-American trade wars, but the European market also contracted due to the pandemic. Jim and Ann Atchison detail hope for the future in the face of these industry problems, including trap limits that would reduce costs for bait, fuel, and traps, while also reducing the number of lines in the water, which can aid the right whale problem. Lobster marketing and expansion of local processing capability can also increase lobster sales and increase income to fishermen, dealers, and others in the industry. Now, 2 years after the Atchison's article, the Maine lobster industry continues to face challenges outlined in this piece and new ones as well. For example, the recent suspension of the Lobster Industry Certificate of Sustainability from the Marine Stewardship Council led to a pause in purchasing Maine's lobsters by some major retailers, such as Whole Foods. These retailers use these certificates as a primary guide for informing consumers about the sourcing of their seafood products. This move to stop buying Maine's lobsters was criticized by Senators Collins and King, Representatives Pingree and Golden, as well as Governor Mills. Now that we have covered the Atchison's arguments, we will move into our panel discussion about their article. We have with us today Rick Wahle, Patrice McCarron, and Geoff Irvine about some of these issues and what the future might hold. Alrighty, thank you all for joining us today. So to each of you, how does the lobster industry most significantly affect the economic and environmental well-being of coastal communities? Are local impacts of Maine's and Atlantic Canada's lobster industries similar or quite different? We'll start with Patrice and Rick to cover Maine and round out with Geoff's Canadian perspective.
Great. Well, I'll kick us off from Maine's perspective. I think it would be impossible to overstate the economic importance of the Maine lobster industry to the state of Maine. We are uniquely structured here in that we have an owner-operator business model. So every vessel in Maine is owned and operated by the captain. So the state licenses about 4,800 people, which means those are 4,800 small businesses. They're located in our rural communities. So all of the money that we earn, which is, between $500 and $750 million a year annually direct at the dock, is spent locally. So in most coastal communities, the first dollar in those communities is oftentimes a lobster dollar. So if we didn't have those lobster dollars, we wouldn't have economic opportunity, we wouldn't have a good tax base, we wouldn't have kids in school. So it really is the foundation of the coast for the state of Maine.
Yep, and for Kent, well, delighted to be here with you to have this discussion. We're so linked in terms of our lobster sector in North America, so we work together on everything. So it's the same in Atlantic Canada and Quebec, Eastern Canada. There are literally hundreds of communities that rely on the lobster sector. I think I did a bit of research, and there are 329 ports in Atlantic Canada, and 174 of them have a landed value of over $1 million per port. So that's a dramatic impact. That's on the harvesting side. On the shore side sector, it's also extremely important. We have literally hundreds of lobster plants in those hundreds of communities. The landed value in 2021 was over $2 billion. So that's ex-vessel money in the pockets of harvesters to pay, to run their businesses, but with some profit at the end of it. And for the exporters, over $3 billion in export value. So by far the most important seafood sector in Canada. And you asked about the environmental well-being. It's a kind of a constant battle between the economic value and the environmental impact of the sector, which we all work on every day to try to mitigate. But certainly the seafood sector and the lobster sector, provides some negative environmental impacts. But I think everybody in the sector works hard to mitigate those.
Great. Well, and I'll just follow on Patrice here too. And first, I just want to say this is such a great opportunity to bring Patrice and Geoff together from both sides of the border, and to celebrate Jim Atchison's contribution to sort of the human side of the lobster science and lobster world. But to get to your question, Eric, Patrice said it well, and I'll just paraphrase. Really, the American lobster, again, is the most valuable single species fishery for both countries. And this, 90% of the US harvest value comes from the Gulf of Maine, and about 80% comes from Maine itself. So Maine is really sort of the elephant in the room when it comes to the US side in any case. While the landed value actually of just the landed value of lobsters comprises about 1 to 2% of Maine's GDP, that's not counting a number of other industries that really depend on this fishery that would really inflate that GDP contribution. So when I'm talking about, everything from trap makers, boat builders, the restaurant industry, tourism, and you can go on. And so, it's just a really important, not only part of Maine's economy, but to our national fisheries economy, and a really important international trade item as well.
Yeah, thank you all for your various perspectives on kind of the greater context of the lobster industry in the North Atlantic area. And Jim and Ann in their article do note and commend the lobster industry on how they jointly manage sustainable harvesting. But there have been increasing concerns and discussions surrounding the practices, and we'll get into those a little bit further, and then climate change on the horizon, as well as external environmental threat. So given the recent developments in cost of operations and relatively lower market price of lobster, how are fishermen with smaller boats and nearshore operations feeling about the future of the lobster industry, and how their long-term business viability compared with fishermen who have larger boats and fish 50 plus miles offshore? How have relaxing of COVID-19 restrictions and changes in overseas markets changed this outlook?
I guess I can jump in again for Maine. The lobster fisheries are wild caught fisheries. So anybody who is a commercial fisherman always knows you're sort of at nature's whim. You never know how much you're going to catch. Lobster fisheries are not quota-based fisheries. So it's survival of the fittest. The most skilled fisherman is going to bring in the biggest catch. But like you say, there's a lot in terms of the cost formula that fishermen cannot control. So, year after year, boat price might be really low or it might be really high. In 2021, we had a record boat price. Lobstermen made a lot of money. Input costs were high, but boat price was actually higher than that, and it was a profitable year. 2022, just a year later, the boat price has been about half of what we saw in 2021, and input costs for the business have skyrocketed even further. So it's a very unpredictable business year to year. I think anybody who fishes is by nature somewhat optimistic, because you have to be crafty to make ends meet. You have to be a skilled fisherman and a skilled business person. You have to know when to set out your gear. You have to know when to spend time on the water when you're going to maximize your catch. And I think, for the harvesters in Maine, they've gotten really good with that. What's difficult for our fleet is that it's very diverse. So you're asking about boats that fish beyond 50 miles from shore. We don't actually have that in Maine. We're an area-based fishery, so we have a state waters only fishery that takes place between 0 and 3 miles from shore. And those are our smallest vessels, and they can be very vulnerable. There's not a lot of wiggle room in that business model. Our larger vessels, we have a handful of boats that would be in the 50-foot range, but we're typically like 35 to 42, 45 feet long. So again, they're not super big boats. There's a lot of unpredictability. Unit costs are high. But I think over time, guys just figure out a way to make it work. They'll adjust their strategy on the fly, and they learn how to put money in the bank in a year like 2021 to offset this year, 2022, where profits are lower. So there are a lot of threats. There's a lot of anxiety. There is a lot of fear about the future, but I would just say fishing's in their blood, and they're gonna go and they're gonna hope for the best, and they're just going to be as flexible and innovative as they can to stay in this business. And so far, so good. People are still here.
Sure. I mean, it's very much the same here, although we do have a significant number of, in certain parts of the area, Southwest New Brunswick and Southwest Nova Scotia, there is a more midshore offshore component. But really the profitability and the business model really depends on how old you are, when you got in, what your costs are. So new entrants are finding it very difficult. But I would argue a bit about low prices. We've really, since 2012, even this year, we've been on an increase of shore prices for 10 years, and it's been really very good for many years. 2021, as Patrice said, was an incredible year, probably the gilded age of lobster, but also the last part of 2020, as soon as the pandemic started to snap back, and really the first half of 2022, our shore prices didn't start to change here until the end of June last year. The fall has been more difficult, but this winter prices are back up, to fairly decent shore prices. So, if you look at the 10-year trend, we've seen nothing but increasing prices every year, and also in the market. We've done a lot of research that shows that 75 to 80% of the export value goes back to the harvester very consistently, year in and year out, and just shows you how kind of healthy the industry is. But it's challenging, and the inputs, I think Jim Atchison calls it the cost price squeeze, and that's a reality the harvesters have, because just because their costs go up doesn't mean they can charge more, because the port price is the port price, and they can't just say, no, we need more today. It doesn't work that way. So it's kind of unfair. But in terms of COVID, the pandemic for the lobster industry was the best thing that ever happened in terms of economic impact. It's a crass way of putting it, but we've never seen a better protein market for lobster. And so as it adjusts out of the pandemic, we're getting more back to sort of where we were in 2019, which was a very strong market as well. I just looked at the export numbers, and 2022 is going to be a big year again. So you just got to keep pushing it and hope we stay on that trajectory.
And Eric, I might just add, and I realize this isn't my wheelhouse, but I'll only put a little bit of a historical perspective on this, pulling from the landings graph that Jim has in his paper there, that just shows, for so long, from the 1880s to the 1980s, landings were almost rock solid, with some dips during the 1920s and 30s. At least I'm speaking for Maine here, and and roughly landing about 20 million pounds a year. And that started dramatically changing in the late 1980s, 1990s. And by about 2016, the 20-teens, Maine was harvesting about 6 times more than it had been in the 1980s. And while we've fallen off that a bit, the value has been maintained, as although there's been these fluctuations we've seen with the coming in and out of the COVID years. But I just want to make the point that there's really a whole generation of fishermen here who've known nothing other but a young generation of fishermen that have known nothing but a booming fishery. And a lot of their older, their elders have been a lot more conservative about, investing in bigger boats and so forth. But this younger generation have gone whole hog into, big boats and venturing offshore, having a couple sternmen. And so I think there's a concern out there that if things start falling off and costs start becoming unsustainable, and with the new whale regulations, that some of these fishermen may be overcapitalized and unable to sustain their businesses at that scale. I'd be interested in, Patrice's or Geoff's perspective on that.
Yeah, I do think that the business model has evolved. I've been with the Lobstermen's Association for 23 years. And from day one, I've heard from the older lobstermen that the young guys are overcapitalized and they're in for a rude awakening. And, at least for this last quarter of a century, that hasn't borne itself out. And there have been some economic investigations that are showing that really the most profitable sector of the industry has been this sort of near shore federal waters fishery, where you're carrying more crew because you're generating overall a lot more income. And I think as we broach the new whale regulations, those are the vessels that have more operating capital. They have more of an ability to invest into high tech, more expensive gear. And they may actually prove to be more resilient to some of the places where this management model is shifting, where you have a small vessel with a single operator. Your ability to adapt is pretty limited. Your business model keeps your footprint really small. It keeps you close to shore. You have very small capital flow, and it does really limit your ability to adapt. So that's one of the things that we've really been advocating for through the association, is that we have to recognize that our fleet is very diverse. And it is the combined diversity of that fleet, from our small inshore boats, our medium, and then our larger boats, that together is what makes this fishery really, really work. And to lose any segment of that would really prove to be devastating. So, I don't know, the jury's still out in terms of the history that's yet to be written, but I guess I'm a little bit skeptical about the fact that people are overcapitalized, because I think that they have really created a modern business model that has proven very, very effective for them, at least so far.
Yeah, I could add from the Canadian perspective something I forgot to mention, and that is that we have very specific defined seasons here. So in virtually 3/4 of the fishery, it's a 2-month season. So you're either fishing May and June, or you're fishing September and October. And that's the whole Gulf of St. Lawrence. That's all of Newfoundland, all of Quebec, all of Cape Breton, all of Eastern Nova Scotia. So those harvesters that have a lobster license generally have another job or a business. And we have the magic in Canada of the employment insurance program that is a part of our social safety network, where harvesters have the ability to have 2 EI claims per year because they're harvesters. So, the reality of the business is a little different when you have that kind of support. But if you have a 2-month season, you kind of need it. And we've set our fishery up to be that way.
Yeah, I think another really noteworthy difference, there's so many similarities between the US and Canadian lobster fisheries, but there are some divergences on the business model. And in Maine, there's no cost to entry. So the cost to get into the fishery in Maine is you find somebody to apprentice with, and then you sort of buy into the fishery at the level that makes sense for how you want to prosecute the fishery. And you start with a low number of traps and you build up. So in Maine, you can get a skiff, you can get used traps, you can build your way through boats. In Canada, there's actually a cost to entry to actually purchase the license. So the barrier of entry in Canada is significantly higher, is a much higher financial output to get in. We've tried to keep Maine sort of more of the traditional model where you can work your way in and kind of not have it be a model where you need, a big pot of money to actually gain access to the fishery. And that really differentiates some of the profit margins and how the fisheries actually operate.
Yeah, and that, I guess the difference as well is that then you can't sell your license when you want to get out. So here you do have to buy your license, but then you can sell it when you retire, which is is all part of the business calculation.
Yep.
These are fascinating differences in how people approach their industry, and I am curious about how far offshore these bigger boats venturing. Because you mentioned largely most of them stay with 0 to 3 miles offshore, as well as kind of if you have an idea of the share of the fishermen that have chosen this more. I don't know if a more capitalized business model and how noticeable that is compared to 10, 20 years ago.
Yeah, so for Maine, the state actually regulates state waters, which are 0 to 3 miles. So every harvester in Maine has a state permit. So the state of Maine issues about 4,800 of those. Of that population, just over 20% also get a federal permit from the federal government. So to cross over the 3 mile line, that's federal waters. You need to be permitted by the federal government. You do actually need to purchase that license. There's a limited number of those, so they have to be transferred from person to person. And depending on the market, those have been as high as $40,000, $50,000 for the permit, and they're sort of sliding back to, $15,000 right now. So we in Maine have about 1,300 federal permit holders. They tend to fish through the winter months. They tend to be on the boats that would be over 40 feet, edging up 50 feet or above. Definitely a higher operating cost, but that allows them to kind of nudge over a little bit into the Canadian model where you're getting to land lobster during the winter time when it's a harder shell lobster, a higher yield lobster, typically a higher price lobster. So the fewer boats who are operating offshore, although it costs more to do that, the cost that you're earning for each lobster that you land tends to be higher and does support that business. I think the big difference between 20 years ago and now is that most of those boats would come in for the summer and then go offshore in the winter. Now, a lot of boats strictly fish in federal waters. And if they do come into state waters, they bring a smaller proportion of their gear. So they've just sort of shifted away and there's more of a separation. It's not, exclusive, but less crossover between those federal vessels and those state vessels because the state only tend to be smaller traps, smaller gangs of gear, and the big boats would have the chance to sort of overwhelm their traps, their boats, their gear. So they've been able to make their living by staying more exclusively in federal waters, which is a big shift.
All right. This is an excellent transition into the next question, which is more environmental and climate related. And this change in behavior I find fascinating among lobstermen. How has warming waters and ocean acidification due to climate change affected current lobster stock and longer-term confidence in the fishery? Is there increasing concern regarding the ecological condition and changing patterns of the Gulf of Maine in general? Rick, if you don't mind starting us off.
Sure, I'd be happy to start that off, and it's a big question. Climate change has certainly played a really important role in the past decades, and we're really seeing its signature on the shifting lobster stocks. And just to sort of set the stage, it's important to realize that there's a really striking temperature gradient from the northeast to the southwest along our coastline. So, Bay of Fundy and eastern Maine are much colder during the summer than, say, southern New England. But all these areas have been warming at about roughly the same rate as a result of climate change. But whereas the southern New England was sort of well into the lobster comfort zone, temperature-wise, if you will, early in that time, as things got water, the adverse effects of warmer temperatures were really taking their toll. We started to see it in the form of mass mortalities in Long Island Sound that knocked the stock down by 75%. It's never really recovered from that. We saw shell disease rear its ugly head back in the late 90s, early 2000s, and prevalence levels went up to like 35% and have just pretty much stayed there ever since, and started spreading to the north. And that really knocked back the southern New England stock seriously. But at the other end of the range in Bay of Fundy in southern New England, in eastern Maine, we saw that that same warming was starting to bring the lobster nursery habitats into the comfort zone of the lobster, and it started to trigger this wave of larval settlement into nursery areas that were otherwise at very low population densities or virtually vacant. Great looking habitat, but nobody's home. That all changed in the early 2000s and into and on up to now. And it ended up elevating the fishery to its current status now as the most valuable single fishery in New England, in the U.S. We're really seeing that eastern Maine area, that boom that we saw there, really accounted for that dramatic shift. But I should also say it's not just climate change. We also have been seeing the effects of depleting groundfish, and groundfish are an important predator in this system. This has been seen throughout the range, whether you're talking Atlantic Canada or the U.S. A lot of people point their finger to the depletion of cod, and certainly cod are an important predator, but really it's the entire assemblage of groundfish that include flatfish, flounder, halibut, goosefish, or monkfish as they're usually called, other bottom-dwelling or near-bottom fish that have been widely depleted since the 1970s, 80s. And so that predator release only acted to favor lobsters. And in fact, I remember talking to fishermen back in the 90s already who were saying, we're catching lobsters in places we've never seen them before, way out in the wide open. Well, there weren't any predators there anymore, or at least the big ones that really take their toll on the small lobsters were severely depleted. So it's a combination. The boom, I think we can say, was the result of the joint effects of both the favorable effects of warming temperatures, but also the depletion of these groundfish. And of course, taking the bigger geographic perspective and including Atlantic Canada, we're seeing this northeastward shift of the center of the population, and definitely southern Gulf of St. Lawrence has been seeing an increasing wave of lobsters, and even Nova Scotia and the northern Gulf of St. Lawrence is seeing higher landings than they've ever seen before. So there's definitely this northward shift as a consequence of warming climate and depleted predators.
It's fascinating how ecological systems function in that way, and how connections ecologically just move in this truly dynamic manner. That Yeah, I mean, you often hear warming waters, you hear moving lobster, so you kind of scratch your head when you see the stocks being caught at this level, but there you have it. The predation being decreased, all because this was happening due to climate change. So we've got some almost increasing northern fishery news, and are there reasons that those of us in the southern part of the fishery are people more nervous?
Yeah, so I can jump in. I think overall, from a fisherman's perspective, climate change has been positive, whether you fish in down East Maine or southern Maine. I think one of the confusing things about the center of abundance shifting north doesn't necessarily mean that things have crashed below. So, as Rick described, in southern New England, that's sort of a different oceanographic regime south of Cape Cod. A different system, and we did see a crash, and that is concerning. But the Gulf of Maine is its own sort of semi-enclosed system, and we have not seen that crash. We've seen landings in southern Maine on a very, very slow increase, above flat, but certainly not on a decline, other than the interannual variability. We saw in the late 90s and the early 2000s, mid-coast Maine is where the center of abundance had really blossomed, where it had been in Casco Bay prior to that, and then more recently in down East Maine, and we're seeing those rises in Canada. But nobody should think that we're not landing lobster in southern Maine or mid-coast Maine anymore. The landings have really been robust and steady, and the resource remains very strong, and people are optimistic about that. I think the other really encouraging thing that came out of the literature on climate change was a study that compared southern New England with the Gulf of Maine. And it found very specifically that the sustainability measures, the stewardship practices that we have in the Gulf of Maine fishery, had they been implemented in southern New England, would have lessened that decline significantly. So we can't prevent climate change. We can't prevent the impacts on the resource, but we certainly have a very robust conservation plan in place, which has provided a buffer. So if Mother Nature is going to provide conditions that are gonna see the lobster stock contract somewhat, we have sort of built in all the protections, and that decline is going to be a lot less severe of a drop off than what they experienced in southern Maine, because we are protecting our baby lobsters and our oversized lobsters, and our bycatch goes back alive. And we just have a lot of really practical measures that I think really honor sort of the biology of the resource in a really practical way. And a lot of that stuff obviously translates up to Canada as well. So I think fishermen remain very optimistic. I think everybody is sort of bracing for some sort of softening of the landings over time. How severe those are going to be, the jury's out. Models say different things, but everything's basically saying, you're not going to continue up here forever. But we feel like there is a business model if the landings do start to soften a little bit in the next few years. And we've seen little bits of that so far. But I don't know, Geoff, probably you're seeing similar but different things up in Canada, right?
Yeah, no, very, very much similar. I was in Newfoundland a few months ago, and I was visiting the first live lobster holding facility in Newfoundland. Hadn't been one there. So that shows you how much more they're landing in Newfoundland and Labrador than ever. The landings in the Gulf of St. Lawrence and Cape Breton, eastern Nova Scotia, all trending up. And in the southern part of the range, southwest New Brunswick and southwest Nova, there's still a wonderful business model there. There's still a great catches. But we're seeing that it's the peak landings were 2016. And we're seeing them kind of weaken off. That's a very recent history. But I think there's definitely some concern about what the future holds. And as we talked about earlier, when you're paying $1 million for a license in LFA 34 and $500,000 for a boat, yeah, that's a big investment. And so this kind of thing keeps people up at night at times, thinking about what the future will hold. So I mean, it's like Patrice said, it's hard to know what it's going to look like, but I think there's absolutely some concern in the southern part of the range and in the northern part. Sort of great enthusiasm and optimism. But as Patrice said, we also have very, very good harvest control rules in place in every LFA. If the stock goes down a certain amount, we have things that the harvesters can implement to adjust their catch, to adjust their effort, to ensure that we keep everything sustainable.
Fascinating. Rick, would you mind elaborating on, for our listeners, how vulnerable lobsters are to acidification, where the science is there for that aspect of this issue?
Yeah, well, the story on acidification is a relatively new and short one compared to our understanding of temperature effects. But it's a topic that really only has gained some traction in 10, 15 years ago. And we're starting to learn a lot across different species and taxa. And with respect to lobsters and crabs, some of the literature's showing that these crustaceans are relatively resistant to acidification effects compared to, say, oysters and clams and so forth, that are very vulnerable, especially at their earliest life stages when shells dissolve on the flats, on the mud flats, just as they're settling. So the concern is less for the American lobster, in any case, less focused on acidification effects or their adverse effects as they are on the direct and indirect effects of warming temperatures. And even among crustaceans, that varies a bit, because as we look west to some of the Alaska crab fisheries, they are their early life stages seem to be more vulnerable to those changes. So, but our American lobster for now looks like, from the work and the literature and some of the work that has been done by my colleagues, suggests that there are mechanisms in place, physiological mechanisms that can cope with these changes in acidification.
Fascinating. Thank you for that elaboration. To go a little deeper on a notable consequence of climate change mentioned by Jim and Ann Atchison in their article, as lobstermen south of Maine experience economic hardships largely due to things like episodic shell disease, how much concern is there along the Maine coast about this specifically? Are there any preventative or mitigating measures for this disease? And these two separate kind of larger capitalized federal waters fishing lobstering operations and the smaller boats, is one group more vulnerable to their share of lobster being affected by episodic shell disease?
I guess I can. So it's not reached a crisis point for the Maine fishery. I mean, certainly that southern New England fishery that had pretty extreme warm water temperatures. I mean, temperatures measured on bottom that were really outside a temperature where you would expect a lobster to survive at all is where we really saw that disease kick off. And as Rick said, we saw it migrate into Maine. The state of Maine puts samplers on boats from May through the end of the year. They do the state waters fishery as well as the offshore fishery. And one of the things that they do record is the presence of episodic shell disease. So we will, on a year-to-year basis, have little pockets, in very small regions along the coast where we might see like more lobsters than we would like to see. But it tends to be female lobsters who are in the reproductive phase who have not shed their shell in a few years. So there were a few years along the way where we saw it in newer shell lobster. And that was very concerning. And that was something that they really monitored to see, is it something where the lobsters have the shell on for a long time, and the shell disease sort of has time to take effect, but they'll ultimately shed it out? Or are we going to see it in this sort of like run of new shell lobster, which represents the majority of the catch in Maine? And we really didn't see that trend hold on. So, you'll get calls in the spring from a handful of lobstermen. I just had, a bunch of female lobsters with shell disease. They immediately call the state of Maine. They immediately report that. I think it is an issue that's elevated enough that if somebody sees an anomaly in their catch, they always calling the state, offering to send up samples. So from my perspective, I have not seen anything that is just sort of like a really low level of sort of annoyance, but in a sector of the lobster stock that has had its shell for a long time is going to molt out of that, and not something that we're really seeing sort of spread across the catch. So I think that translates into a pretty minimal economic impact on the fishery, and something that much more rare we would hear in the offshore waters. Like every once in a while, like a deep pocket of warm water, somebody might pull up a few. Again, a lobster that's had its shell for a long time, a lobster that's going to molt out of that, and not something that we're really seeing spreading through what's going to be the majority of our catch, those newer shell lobsters. So I don't know, Rick, if you've seen anything different than that in the data, but that seems to be the way that the trend has gone the last 5 years or so.
Yeah. I think you captured it pretty well there, Patrice. The highest prevalence levels are essentially in the warmest places, and also among the lobsters that hold onto their shells the longest. So the warmest places are near shore, southern New England, and we see the highest prevalence among the larger, oversized lobsters, but especially as Patrice said, the egg-bearing females that are holding onto their shells longer, their exoskeletons longer. So, but once that the epizootic took off, it did start spreading northward, and it did start penetrating Maine waters. It sort of wrapped around Cape Cod and into Massachusetts waters, north of Cape Cod Bay, and it reached its tendrils into southwestern Maine. But it seems to have more or less stabilized that pattern hasn't changed a lot in, say, the past 10 years. So, but with increasing warming, the suggestion is that we might see higher prevalence levels, but especially in southern New England. In southern Maine, if at all in Maine.
That's definitely something to keep our eyes on as the years go on. According to NOAA Fisheries, approximately 368 North Atlantic right whales are left after what they define as an, quote, unusual mortality event, end quote, which has occurred since 2017. As the recent passage of the omnibus spending bill here in the States included a 6-year pause on federal whale regulations, as well as funding for marine ecological research and fishing gear technological development. Can you all weigh in on the significance of this pause and U.S. federal government investment in those research and technological development initiatives? Which research priorities do you all think are most important to fishermen as the North Atlantic right whales and the greater North Atlantic marine ecosystem? And what do we know and not know about this endangered species? And how is this debate playing out in Canada as well?
That is a broad question.
Yep. An easy one here.
I'll kick it off. Yeah, I'll kick it off. Maybe I'll just answer a piece of it, and we can sort of circle through and work our way through. In terms of the pause that we got from the federal government, that's truly historic, and very, very meaningful for our fishery. The U.S. lobster fishery, we implemented whale protection measures in the 90s. We did a significant round of whale protection measures in 2009, another significant round in 2014. And then in May of 2022, we did a brand new 60% risk reduction, off of our revised baseline. So we've taken rope out of the water, we've weakened rope, we've really expanded our gear marking. We now have closures on the books in Maine. So super high impact for our fishermen. The Maine fishery was scheduled to bring that 60% risk reduction all the way up to 90% risk reduction by 2024. And that is controversial because the Maine fishery doesn't really have a documented track record of entanglement. So a lot of the risk that we're mitigating now in Maine is hypothetical risk. We know where some of the entanglements take place. We know what fisheries they come from, but for a lot, we don't know. When we look at rope that right whales are carrying, we can say it doesn't really look like the rope that Maine fishermen use. We tend to fish a smaller diameter rope than some of the rope that comes off. So the Maine lobster fishery has really been advocating to kind of put the brakes on and have the federal government reanalyze the science. We feel like they haven't followed the law as prescribed by the Endangered Species Act. What the federal government has done in giving us our risk reduction goals is they've basically said, anytime we get to a decision point in our data or modeling, we're just going to pick the worst case scenario so that we make sure that the whales get the most protection possible. But actually what the law requires is that the federal government examine scenarios that are reasonably certain to occur. So not things that are like so far-fetched that they will never happen. So we feel like, bringing us to a 90% risk reduction, and ultimately we're slated to do a 98% risk reduction, is something that would have potentially marginal benefit to the whales, but would have devastating impacts on our fishery. So this pause allows us time to kind of dig into these models, look at the data that we're using, really examine the implications of the assumptions. And I'll give you an example of why that matters. When the federal government did a forward population projection for right whales, they said, how many right whales do we think we will have in the year 2050? And when they used very conservative estimates of reproduction, they used 2010 to 2018 in every scenario. Even with closing the US federal fisheries, the right whale population continued to decline. If they simply used the full reproductive data set, so the 90s through 2019, in every scenario, projecting that population forward, the right whale population basically doubled. And so it begs the question, which is it? You took the worst 10 years on record or the worst 8 years on record for a set of data that is without trend. And for us, it doesn't make any sense. They didn't really ask the question of, well, is it likely that whales are going to continue to, have more success in reproduction? And since then they have. So we feel like, they've just made very bad assumptions that will harm the fishery. So this federal pause, Congress recognizes that there's a lot of work to be done. They actually haven't solved the problem, but they've given National Marine Fisheries Service and the fishing industry and the conservation community and all of the stakeholders time to come together and really dig through those questions and try to figure out, what the right risk reduction would be for our fishery so that we can hopefully have a functioning industry and save the right whales. And in terms of the funding, that was a really important piece of the pause. There's a lot of money that's going to come in for right whale monitoring and surveillance, so have a better idea of where right whales are. Models are now indicating that right whales will be even less frequent in the waters where Maine lobstermen fish and shifting more into Canadian waters and down to the Southeast US in the winter. So to really get a handle on where are the whales, like what are the fishing areas where we really need to be prioritizing for management will be important. But there's also a lot of money in there to continue to develop innovative gear solutions, which would include on-demand fishing without rope, as well as other modifications to a traditional fishing system that would pose less risk to whales, that would allow maybe a more flexible, viable business model for some of the smaller vessels in our fleet. So there's a lot of really, really important stuff in there. And it has set a high bar for all of us. We have a lot of work to do over the next 6 years to try to get answers and hopefully size that management to really address the actual risks that the right whales are facing. So I guess I'll leave it at that.
Thanks. So the whales effectively came to Canada in 2017, and we did not expect them. They didn't tell us they were coming, and so that is when we had that spectacular, terrible mortality event, which caused us to immediately figure out how we could continue fishing crab and lobster and avoid mortalities and entanglement. So we brought in a whole suite of measures, the dynamic closure management system, where we have overflights and things that monitor whales. So if we see a single right whale in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, we close 9 grids for 15 days. And if another whale is sighted, we close it for the whole season. So we've got we've invested millions of dollars in that system, and it appears to be working mostly. We've also done a lot of things that Patrice talked about, removing gear and gear marking and all kinds of other things like that we hope will work. So the whole fishing industry is committed to it. We know it's vital to ensure market access to the US, to everywhere else that cares about right whales. I mean, we have customers in Europe and Scandinavia, in Asia, who are constantly asking us, where are we with these measures? So it's important for the market. And back to the challenges in Maine, we've always wondered why the Maine harvesters had been so impacted by these measures by NOAA, because we like Patrice know that there are a lot of whales there when they are fishing. So we could never understand that. And also, we buy half of Maine's lobster in Canada. We're your biggest customer. And so we need that lobster to keep our plants going in the summer and the fall. So we've been very concerned about your industry, notwithstanding all of our close relations. So we were delighted to hear about the pause, and we're delighted to hear about more research. I think one big thing that Rick will probably talk about is some of the work that he's going to do with the new NNA Lobster Network, which will do some of that work. But no, we're taking it very seriously, and the new measures, every year the federal fisheries minister adjusts the measures, and we expect her announcement to come out in the next few weeks for this coming year. But the fishing industry here is committed to doing what it takes.
Yeah, perfectly. Well, both of you did. And really this pause brings more than $50 million to start to address these really important questions. And they go toward both lobster and right whales and the communities that depend on this fishery. So as Patrice said, this is an unprecedented opportunity to start to deal with these thorny issues. But I might divide the challenges into short-term and long-term questions, because certainly, resolving the entanglement issue, area closures and so forth, understanding right whale migration patterns and so forth, tracking them around, fields of lobster gear are really urgent needs, and also understanding the impact of the new regulations potentially on our coastal communities. All that's really urgent to know. But a lot of these changes that are happening as a consequence of climate change, and we're going to be seeing longer term decadal scale changes happening. We're already seeing them. And it's really important to start to understand the mechanisms behind them. And this is where you really have to sort of back up and take the broader geographic view that not only encompasses our two fisheries, the US and Canada fisheries, Atlantic Canada and basically New England, but really pan back to the North Atlantic and start to understand what's happening here. And what's really interesting is that some of these dramatic changes that have been happening pivot around 2010, when there was a dramatic regime shift in the Gulf of Maine. All of a sudden, we started to see warmer Gulf Stream water moving into the Gulf of Maine, and that had food web level effects. And let me just put that in a somewhat broader geographic perspective. You know, we have really two currents that are that merge right off our coast. There's of course the Gulf Stream I just mentioned, coming from the south with warm, salty, nutrient poor water, and then we have the Labrador current coming from the Arctic, bringing really cold, nutrient-rich water. And it's that Labrador current and the Scotian shelf water that has really fueled the huge historic productivity that the Gulf of Maine is so well known for. And in recent years, and again, pivoting around 2010, we started to see the Gulf Stream waters play a more important role in influencing the productivity of the system. And that's where we started to see things collapsing to some extent. Primary productivity, the phytoplankton that feed the zooplankton that right whales depend on, as well as things like herring and even cod larvae and sand lance. All those forage fish are strongly affected by the abundance of these tiny crustaceans called copepods. And there's a particular copepod called Calanus finmarchicus that seems to be a real keystone species here. And it's the prime and preferred food source for the Atlantic right whale. And so that shift in the distribution of Calanus finmarchicus and some of these other cold water zooplankton to the north has played a role in influencing the migration of the right whale to northern waters, and more prevalently in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So we've just secured some additional funding from the National Science Foundation to start to look at what's influencing these relative influences of the Labrador Current and the Gulf Stream, and they're linked to the changes that are happening in the Arctic. And so the program that's funding this is one of National Science Foundation's polar programs called Navigating the New Arctic. And it's really the only project in that portfolio of grants that have been funded that's looking at the effects of Arctic change at lower latitudes, at a lower latitude system. Most of those projects are looking at changes in the Arctic and the consequences in the Arctic. And here we're looking at the lower latitude effects. But having that larger scale view allows us to build these predictive models that essentially give us the lead time out decades, refining those predictive models so we can better understand these linkages between the changing climate, shifting lobster distributions, and shifting and migrating right whales.
Got it. Yeah, as a data person myself, there always seems to be a need for more, and then it's great to see so many resources poured into learning more, which is absolutely necessary. And yeah, if folks would like to learn more about the North Atlantic right whale, as much as we do know, their habitat range, how many we think are out there, and the context in which some of these fatalities have occurred is on the NOAA fisheries website for you to learn more. They've got maps and tables So as we're closing out here on our hour, are there any other things that you all would like to share about the lobster industry that we haven't already covered? Next steps for policymakers, citizens, the lobster industry itself. We'll start off with Geoff.
Keep eating lobster. I mean, we've got a myriad of challenges and issues that are based on the world getting more insular and market access challenges, where we're noticing it in all of the markets. The deglobalization of the world, it's more challenging to sell protein everywhere around the world. So we spend a lot of time dealing with those market access issues, and I'm sure our people who are exporting lobster from Maine do the same. So that's just a really high level matter that we're not going to solve today, but it's something that is becoming more and more of a challenge, and that is worldwide sort of nationalism and market access sort of putting barriers up that I'm seeing every day.
Patrice, would you like to go next?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I would echo Geoff's suggestion, like eat more lobster. I hope that people took away from this the incredible sustainability practices in place in the US and Canadian lobster fisheries. They are virtually unmatched internationally. These are quite literally the most sustainable fisheries in the world. You know, throughout time where fisheries have been depleted and overfished and stocks have crashed, you know, these fisheries have blossomed. You know, in part, Mother Nature has given us a hand. But really, it would not have been possible without the incredible conservation practices in place in both countries. And I hope people also understand the commitment that both countries have to North Atlantic right whale conservation. All of the fisheries, the shipping industry, the governments are really trying to get measures in place that will allow these, you know, incredible heritage fisheries and traditions to continue. And conserve this like incredible endangered species that is at risk. And people should feel really good that the fisheries are in fact making changes, that they are actively continuing to improve what they're doing. And people should feel proud to choose this product and not be confused by the media and wonder, you know, if they're doing the right thing, because so much time and energy has gone into really getting it right and really having an industry we hope that we will be handing off to the next generation proudly in both countries. So
great. Well, it seems fitting to sort of close this out with a little quote from Jim Atchison himself. And there's this wonderful book he wrote in 1988 called The Lobster Gangs of Maine. And, you know, it's close to my heart because he did a lot of his interviews. You know, he was an anthropologist, and so he studied the social systems of territoriality and used the American lobster fisheries, his case study. And so he said that the very first words in that book were, "High risk and uncertainty in all parts of the world are the everyday lot of the fishermen." And, you know, I think we just reinforced that message with this podcast today. But I think we also take away a really strong message of the sustainability ethic of the participants in this fishery. They are, you know, they're essentially naturalists in the field every day. They're seeing these changes happening. Their fishery is in their own backyard, and it's in their best interest to make it sustainable. So that sustainability ethic and conservation ethic is in their blood, and right whales are part of the ecosystem in which they live, and want to see them continue to thrive. So it just means bringing people together to work on this project and problem.
There were some excellent closing words there. Thank you all so much for joining us today, Patrice, Geoff, and Rick. And we will have you look forward to checking in, hopefully, with you all again sometime in the future.
Great, Eric.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Eric.
What you just heard was Rick Wahle's, Patrice McCarron's, and Geoff Irvine's perspectives on the lobster industry as discussed by James Atchison and Ann Atchison in their article, What Does the Future Hold for Maine's Lobster Industry? Maine Policy Review is a peer-reviewed academic journal published by the Margaret Chase Smith Policy Center. For all citations for data provided in this episode, please refer to the original article in Maine Policy Review. Special thanks to the Lobster Institute at the University of Maine for sponsoring this episode of Maine Policy Matters. Since 1987, the Lobster Institute has been fostering collaboration and communication in support of a sustainable and profitable lobster industry in the Northeast United States and Canada, as well as aiming to maximize the engagement of UMaine faculty and students with stakeholders in this iconic fishery. The editorial team for Maine Policy Matters is made up of Joyce Rummery, Linda Silka, and Barbara Harity. Jonathan Rubin directs the Policy Center. A thank you to Jason Heim and Catherine Swaha, script writers for Maine Policy Matters, and to Daniel Susi, our production consultant. In 2 weeks, we will be reading a summary of Jonathan Rubin et al.'s research on road salt in their report entitled Road Salt in Maine, an assessment of practices, impacts, and safety. We'd like to thank you for listening to Maine Policy Matters from the Margaret Chase Smith Policy Center at the University of Maine. You can find us online by searching Maine Policy Matters on your web browser. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow us on your preferred social media platform to stay updated on new episode releases. I'm Eric Miller. Thanks for listening, and please join us next time on Maine Policy Matters.